July 28, 2014. A man died quietly in his sleep at a retirement home in Stone Mountain, Georgia. He was 93 years old. His death barely made national news. A few obituaries appeared in newspapers. Military veterans organizations issued statements of condolence, but most Americans had no idea who he was or what he represented. Theodore Jerome Van Kirk Dutch, to his friends, was the last living person who had been aboard the Enola Gay on August 6, 1945, when it dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. With his death, the final direct witness to one of history's most significant and controversial moments was gone. No one remained who could say, "I was there. This is what I saw. This is what I felt." Van Kirk spent 69 years living with that experience. Unlike some who participated in morally ambiguous historical events, he never expressed regret. He never apologized. He never second-guessed the decision. Until his final interviews months before his death, Van Kirk maintained that dropping the atomic bomb was absolutely necessary, morally justified, and saved millions of lives by ending the war quickly. "I knew when we got the assignment it was going to be an emotional thing," he said in one of his last interviews. "We had feelings, but we had to put them in the background. We did what we had to do." This is the story of the last man who dropped the atomic bomb. Not the story of the bomb itself, but the story of one man who carried that burden for 7 decades and never wavered in his conviction that it was the right thing to do. Theodore Jerome Van Kirk was born on February 27, 1921, in Northumberland, Pennsylvania, a small coal mining town along the Susquehanna River. His family called him Dutch, a common nickname for people of German or Dutch ancestry. His father worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. His mother raised Dutch and his siblings in a modest home where money was always tight, but love was abundant. Dutch grew up during the Great Depression, learning early that nothing came easy and that you worked for everything you got. As a boy, Dutch was fascinated by aviation. Charles Lindbergh had flown solo across the Atlantic in 1927, when Dutch was 6 years old. The newspapers and radio couldn't stop talking about it. Aviation represented adventure, technology, freedom, everything that seemed impossible for a kid from a railroad family in a small Pennsylvania town. Dutch built model airplanes from wood and paper. He read every magazine article about aviation he could find. He dreamed of flying. In high school, Dutch excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and science. Navigation, he discovered, was essentially advanced mathematics applied to geography and astronomy. If you could calculate angles, speeds, and distances, you could tell a pilot exactly where to go. Dutch found this intellectually satisfying in a way that other subjects weren't. There was a right answer and a wrong answer. Numbers didn't lie. If you did the calculations correctly, you arrived at your destination. If you miscalculated, you got lost or crashed. The precision appealed to him. After graduating high school in 1939, Dutch enrolled at Susquehanna University, intending to study chemistry. But world events were moving faster than anyone anticipated. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, starting what would become the Second World War. By 1940, German forces had conquered most of Western Europe. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. In 1941, as Dutch completed his sophomore year, tensions between the United States and Japan were escalating. War seemed inevitable. Dutch had joined the Civilian Pilot Training Program, a federal initiative designed to create a pool of trained pilots in case America entered the war. He learned to fly Piper Cubs, small single-engine aircraft used for training. He discovered he loved flying, the freedom, the perspective. the challenge of controlling a machine in 3 dimensions. But he also discovered something else. He liked being in the air, but he didn't necessarily want to be the one flying. Navigation interested him more than piloting. He wanted to be the person who told the pilot where to go, the person who ensured the mission succeeded by plotting the correct course. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Dutch was 20 years old and in his 3rd year of college. Like millions of young American men, he immediately knew his life was about to change. The next day, President Roosevelt declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. America was now fighting a 2-front war against powerful enemies. The military would need pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, everyone who could contribute to the air war. Dutch enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces in December 1941. He could have waited to be drafted, but waiting wasn't in his nature. If war was coming, he wanted to choose his role rather than have it chosen for him. He applied for navigation training. The military desperately needed navigators. As air operations expanded, finding qualified navigators became critical. Flying across oceans, bombing targets in enemy territory, finding your way home in darkness or bad weather, all of this required skilled navigation. Dutch's mathematical aptitude and pilot training made him an ideal candidate. Navigation training was intense. Dutch attended classes at Mather Field in California, where he learned celestial navigation, dead reckoning, pilotage, and radio navigation. Celestial navigation involved using a sextant to measure the angles of stars and the sun, then calculating position from those measurements. Dead reckoning meant estimating position based on speed, time, and direction from a known starting point. Pilotage was navigation by visual landmarks. Radio navigation used radio beacons and direction-finding equipment. A competent navigator needed to master all these techniques because anyone could fail in combat conditions. Dutch excelled. His mathematical skills made the calculations easy. His methodical personality suited navigation's demands for precision and attention to detail. He graduated from navigation school in February 1943 and was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant. At 21 years old, Dutch Van Kirk was now a certified navigator in the United States Army Air Forces, qualified to guide bombers across oceans and continents to their targets. His first assignment was with the 97th Bombardment Group, flying B-17 Flying Fortresses in the European theater. Dutch arrived in England in spring 1943, as American bombing campaigns against Germany were intensifying. The U.S. 8th Air Force was conducting daylight precision bombing raids on German industrial targets, suffering terrible casualties from German fighters and anti-aircraft fire. B-17 crews faced 50-50 odds of surviving a 25-mission tour of duty. Half of them would die or be shot down and captured. Dutch flew his missions. He navigated bombers through flak-filled skies over Germany. He brought crews home through clouds and darkness. He watched other aircraft explode or spiral down trailing smoke. He saw parachutes sometimes. Often there were no parachutes, just aircraft disintegrating and crews dying instantly. Combat was brutal, random, and terrifying. But Dutch did his job. Calculate the course, monitor wind drift, update position, give the pilot headings, get the aircraft to the target and back home. That was the mission, and Dutch completed it again and again. Among Dutch's crewmates was a pilot named Paul Tibbets. Tibbets was several years older than most pilots, an experienced aviator who had been flying since before the war. He was confident, competent, and respected by his crews. Tibbets and Van Kirk flew multiple missions together. They developed a professional rapport based on mutual competence. Tibbets trusted Van Kirk's navigation. Van Kirk trusted Tibbets's flying. In combat aviation, trust was everything. Your life depended on the crew doing their jobs correctly. In 1944, Tibbets was pulled from combat operations and sent back to the United States for a classified assignment. Dutch completed his tour of duty in Europe and also returned to the States. He had flown his missions. He had survived. Many hadn't. Dutch could have requested non-combat duty for his next assignment, training navigators, working in operations, anything that didn't involve flying over enemy territory. But that wasn't how Dutch saw things. If there was still a war to fight, he would fight it. In September 1944, Dutch received orders to report to Wendover Army Airfield in Utah. The orders were vague. Classified project. Details would be provided upon arrival. Dutch had no idea what he was getting into. Wendover was in the middle of nowhere. Salt flats, desert, nothing for miles. Why would the military station anyone there? When Dutch arrived, he discovered that Paul Tibbets commanded the unit, the 509th Composite Group. Tibbets was assembling crews for a secret mission. He personally selected every man, choosing people he had flown with or who came highly recommended. When Tibbets learned Dutch was available, he immediately requested him as his navigator. "I need someone I trust," Tibbets told him. "I can't tell you details yet, but this is going to be the most important mission of the war. Are you in?" Dutch was in. If Tibbets thought he could do the job, that was good enough. The 509th Composite Group trained at Wendover for months. The crews flew modified B-29 Superfortresses, the newest and most advanced bombers in the American arsenal. But their training was strange. They practiced precision bombing with single bombs rather than the usual cluster bombing tactics. They flew at high altitude over 30,000 feet. They practiced sharp diving turns after bomb release, a maneuver designed to get away from the target as quickly as possible. The bombardiers worked with bombs that had unusual shapes, round bombs unlike anything crews had seen before. Nobody told them why. Security was absolute. Crews were forbidden from discussing training with anyone outside the unit. Letters home were censored. Visitors weren't allowed. The 509th existed in isolation, training for a mission that remained mysterious. Dutch didn't speculate much about the mission's nature. He was a navigator. His job was to get the aircraft to the target and back. What happened at the target was someone else's responsibility. Still, the emphasis on precision and the peculiar bombing techniques suggested something unusual. Whatever bomb they would drop must be extraordinarily powerful if one bomb required such special handling and if crews needed to escape so quickly after release. In May 1945, the 509th Composite Group deployed to Tinian Island in the Mariana Islands, a U.S.-controlled territory in the Pacific. From Tinian, B-29s could reach Japan. The unit's mission, whatever it was, would be conducted from there. The men lived in specially constructed quarters separated from other units. Security remained absolute. They flew practice missions over Japan, dropping conventional bombs to familiarize themselves with routes and conditions, but also to prevent the Japanese from becoming suspicious about aircraft flying unusual patterns. By early August 1945, the situation in the Pacific War was reaching a critical point. Germany had surrendered in May. Japan fought alone. American forces had captured islands progressively closer to Japan. Okinawa, captured in June after 3 months of brutal fighting, was within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. American aircraft firebombed Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Naval blockades strangled Japanese shipping. Japan's situation was hopeless, but the militaristic government refused to surrender unconditionally, which was the only surrender the Allies would accept. American military planners were preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. Estimates suggested such an invasion could cost 1 million American casualties and many millions of Japanese casualties, both military and civilian. Japan's military indoctrinated soldiers and civilians to fight to the death rather than surrender. Kamikaze attacks demonstrated the lengths to which Japan would go. Okinawa showed that Japanese resistance, even in hopeless circumstances, inflicted terrible casualties. Invading Japan's home islands would be a bloodbath. Then, in mid-July, something happened in the New Mexico desert that changed everything. The Manhattan Project, the top-secret program to develop atomic weapons, successfully tested an atomic bomb at the Trinity site. The explosion was more powerful than most scientists had predicted. It proved that atomic weapons were viable. The United States possessed a weapon that could destroy entire cities with a single bomb. President Truman, who had become president when Roosevelt died in April, faced an agonizing decision: use atomic bombs against Japan, or proceed with conventional invasion. Truman's calculation was straightforward. If atomic bombs could shock Japan into surrendering, they would save hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives. The firebombing campaigns had already killed more civilians than atomic bombs would likely kill. From Truman's perspective, using atomic weapons was the least destructive option available. He authorized their use. On August 2nd, Colonel Paul Tibbets told his crews what they had been training for. They were going to drop atomic bombs on Japanese cities. Nobody knew exactly what atomic bombs did, but scientists said they would be devastating. Far more powerful than any conventional bomb, capable of destroying entire cities. Crews would need to be miles away when the bomb detonated to avoid the blast and radiation. Dutch Van Kirk listened to the briefing with professional detachment. So this was why they had trained so carefully. Precision navigation would be critical. Get to the target. Drop the bomb. Get away. The mission made sense now. Dutch understood the stakes. If these bombs could end the war without an invasion, thousands, maybe millions of lives would be saved. American soldiers wouldn't have to storm Japanese beaches. Japanese civilians wouldn't have to fight to the death in their cities. This mission could end the nightmare. Tibbets asked Dutch if he had any concerns. Dutch said no. He understood what they were being asked to do. He understood why. He was ready. The primary target was Hiroshima, an industrial city and military headquarters. The secondary target was Kokura. The tertiary target was Nagasaki. Weather would determine which city would be bombed. August 6th was chosen as the mission date. Weather forecasts predicted clear skies over the primary target. On August 5th, the B-29 designated for the mission was named Enola Gay, after Tibbets's mother. 12 men were selected for the crew, though only 3 Tibbets, Van Kirk, and Bombardier Thomas Ferebee had essential roles. Tibbets would fly the aircraft. Van Kirk would navigate. Ferebee would release the bomb. The others provided critical support: co-pilot, flight engineer, radio operator, radar operator, tail gunner, and weaponeer, the specialist who armed the bomb. The atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, was loaded into Enola Gay's bomb bay. It weighed nearly 10,000 pounds, shaped like a long cylinder with fins at the back. It contained 64 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. When the bomb exploded, it would generate a fireball hotter than the surface of the sun and a blast wave that would flatten buildings for miles. The crew attended a final briefing. Chaplains offered prayers for those who wanted them. Dutch didn't pray. He wasn't particularly religious, and besides, prayer seemed beside the point. They had a job to do. Prayer wouldn't change that. Professional competence would get them through, not divine intervention. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, Enola Gay took off from Tinian's North Field. The B-29 climbed into darkness, heading northwest toward Japan. Dutch worked his navigation station, calculating their course, monitoring fuel consumption, tracking position. The flight would take approximately 6 hours to reach Hiroshima. Everything had to be perfect. Weather aircraft had flown ahead to scout conditions over the targets and confirm that Hiroshima's skies were clear. The crew maintained radio silence. Flying at 31,000 feet, they passed over the Pacific Ocean as dawn broke. Dutch watched the sun rise, a brilliant orange glow spreading across the horizon. He thought about his family back in Pennsylvania. They had no idea where he was or what he was doing. They probably thought he was flying routine missions. Nobody could know the truth. This mission was so secret that crew families wouldn't learn details for years. As they approached Japan, Dutch gave Tibbets headings to bring them to the initial point, the place where Ferebee would begin his bomb run. Navigation had to be precise within seconds and feet. If they missed the target, they would have wasted the mission and might have to try again another day. But Dutch's calculations were perfect. At 8:09 a.m., they reached the initial point. Ferebee took over, peering through his Norden bomb sight at the city below. Hiroshima spread out beneath them, a river delta city with bridges, factories, residential districts, military installations. Nearly 350,000 people lived there. Most were civilians, though thousands of soldiers were stationed there as well. The city had not been heavily bombed yet, because American planners wanted an intact target to assess the atomic bomb's effects. At 8:15 and 17 seconds, Ferebee released Little Boy. The bomb dropped away, falling toward the city. Tibbets immediately threw the Enola Gay into a sharp diving right turn, a maneuver they had practiced dozens of times. They needed to be at least 9 miles away when the bomb detonated to avoid the blast. Dutch felt the G-forces pressing him into his seat as the aircraft banked violently. 43 seconds after release, Little Boy exploded 1,900 feet above Hiroshima. Dutch saw a brilliant flash of light brighter than anything he had ever seen, brighter than the sun. For a moment, he couldn't see anything else. Then his vision cleared, and he saw the fireball expanding below them. The temperature at the center of the fireball exceeded 1 million degrees Celsius. Everything within half a mile vaporized instantly. The blast wave radiated outward at supersonic speed, collapsing buildings, igniting fires, killing tens of thousands instantly. Dutch watched a mushroom cloud form, boiling upward thousands of feet, glowing orange and purple and black. The scale was incomprehensible. They had just dropped one bomb, and an entire city was being destroyed. Dutch had flown over bombed cities in Europe. He knew what destruction looked like. But this was different. This was obliteration on a scale that shouldn't be possible. The shock wave reached the Enola Gay, buffeting the aircraft even though they were miles away. Tibbets fought to keep control as the plane rocked. They took photographs, documenting the explosion, the cloud, the destruction, then turned for home. The mission had taken less than 12 hours from takeoff to landing. In that time, they had changed history. When they landed back at Tinian, they were met with cheers and congratulations. Military officials told them they had just ended the war. Japan would surely surrender now. No nation could withstand atomic weapons. The invasion wouldn't be necessary. Millions of lives had been saved. Dutch felt relief more than anything else. They had done it. The mission was successful. Nobody on the crew was hurt. The bomb worked as intended. If this ended the war, then all the horror would finally stop. No more kamikaze attacks, no more firebombing raids, no more battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. It would be over. But Japan didn't surrender immediately. The Japanese military government was paralyzed by internal debate. Some wanted to surrender. Others wanted to fight on. Emperor Hirohito, who had been largely ceremonial, finally intervened and announced Japan's intention to accept surrender terms, but only after a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th. Between the two bombs, approximately 200,000 people died immediately, with many more dying later from burns and radiation sickness. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. The war was over. World War II, which had killed over 60 million people worldwide, had ended. Atomic weapons had ended it. Dutch Van Kirk returned to the United States a hero. The Enola Gay crew was celebrated. They appeared at public events. Newspapers interviewed them. They received medals and commendations. President Truman personally thanked them. Dutch was 24 years old and one of the most famous people in America. But fame was uncomfortable for Dutch. He wasn't a showman. He wasn't interested in publicity. He had done his job as a navigator, same as he had done on dozens of other missions. That this particular mission happened to involve an atomic bomb didn't change the fundamental nature of his role. He calculated the course. He got the aircraft to the target. The rest was someone else's responsibility. Dutch wanted to move on with his life. He had joined the military to fight a war. The war was over. Now he wanted to do what millions of other veterans wanted: finish his education, start a career, get married, have a family, live a normal life. The atomic bomb mission would be part of his history, but it didn't have to be his entire identity. Dutch stayed in the military for several more years, serving in various capacities, including as an instructor and in administrative roles. But military life during peacetime didn't suit him. In 1946, he returned to Susquehanna University to complete his degree in chemistry. He graduated in 1947, finally finishing the education that Pearl Harbor had interrupted. In 1948, Dutch married Jean Garner, a woman he had known since before the war. They had 2 sons together, built a home, and created the stable family life that Dutch had dreamed about during the war years. Dutch worked as a chemical engineer for DuPont, a major chemical company, where he had a successful career spanning decades. He wasn't Theodore Van Kirk, navigator of the Enola Gay. He was just Dutch, husband and father, chemical engineer, a man living an ordinary American life in the post-war suburbs. But the atomic bomb mission never truly left him. As the years passed and the 50th, then 60th, then 70th anniversaries of Hiroshima approached, journalists increasingly sought out Enola Gay crew members for interviews and documentaries. Dutch participated in some, but avoided most. He didn't enjoy talking about the mission, not because he regretted it, he never regretted it, but because he found the constant rehashing tiresome. What more was there to say? They dropped the bomb. The war ended. Millions of lives were saved by not invading Japan. That was the story. Other crew members dealt with the mission differently. Some refused all interviews. Others wrote memoirs. A few experienced mental health struggles, though whether related to the atomic mission or to combat trauma generally was unclear. Jacob Beeser, the radar countermeasures officer, became an engineer and lived a quiet life, rarely discussing the mission. Robert Lewis, the co-pilot, was more conflicted, reportedly writing in his journal during the mission, "My God, what have we done?" though he later insisted he had no regrets. Thomas Ferebee, the bombardier who physically released the bomb, rarely gave interviews and died in 2000 at age 80. Paul Tibbets, the pilot and mission commander, took the opposite approach from most crew members. He embraced his role in history, giving numerous interviews, writing a memoir and defending the atomic bombings until his death in 2007. Tibbets never expressed regret. "I sleep clearly every night," he said repeatedly. He rejected critics who called the bombings war crimes or unnecessary acts of cruelty. "We were in a war," Tibbets would say. "Our job was to win that war with the least loss of American lives. That's what we did." Dutch's perspective aligned closely with Tibbets. Both men saw the atomic bomb as a weapon terrible, yes, but not fundamentally different in moral terms from the firebombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, or the conventional warfare that killed millions. War itself was the moral catastrophe. The atomic bomb was simply war's logical endpoint, maximum destructive force delivered with maximum efficiency. If killing 100,000 with one bomb ended the war faster than killing them with conventional weapons over months, wasn't that preferable? Critics would argue no, that atomic weapons crossed a moral line, that they were inherently different from conventional weapons, that using them against civilian populations was never justified. Dutch heard these arguments over the years. He understood them intellectually, but emotionally and morally, he couldn't accept them. He had seen conventional war. He had seen what happened to bomber crews over Germany, to soldiers at Okinawa, to civilians in firebombed cities. Atomic weapons were more efficient, but were they truly more immoral? Dutch couldn't see the distinction. As Dutch aged, the Enola Gay crew grew smaller. Crew members died one by one. Cancer, heart disease, strokes, the inevitable ailments of aging. Each death brought renewed media attention. Another Enola Gay crewman dies. The shrinking number of survivors made those remaining more precious to historians and journalists. Dutch found himself increasingly alone in carrying the memory. Morris Jepson, the weaponeer who armed Little Boy during the flight, died in 2010. Richard Nelson, the radio operator, died in 2003. Theodore Dutch Van Kirk outlived them all. By 2007, when Tibbets died at age 92, Dutch was the last man standing. All the others were gone. Dutch was the sole survivor of the most famous bombing mission in history. Being the last survivor changed Dutch's relationship with the mission. When he was one of several crew members, journalists could interview others for different perspectives. When he became the only one left, Dutch became the sole living repository of direct experience. What he remembered, what he said, carried unique weight. He was no longer just a participant. He was the last witness. Dutch took this responsibility seriously in his final years. He gave more interviews in his 80s and early 90s than he had given in previous decades. He spoke at military events, historical conferences, and educational programs. He wanted people to understand the mission from the perspective of those who carried it out. He wanted to counter narratives that portrayed the crew as callous killers or traumatized victims. They were neither. They were military personnel who did their duty in extraordinary circumstances. In interviews during his final years, Dutch was remarkably consistent in his messaging. "We were at war," he would say. "Japan was the aggressor. They attacked us. We responded with the means available to end the war as quickly as possible. The atomic bomb did that. It saved American lives and Japanese lives. I don't regret my role in that." Interviewers would press him. But what about the civilians? The children who died? The people vaporized without warning? Dutch's response never varied. War kills civilians. Conventional bombing killed more civilians in total than atomic bombs did. The firebombing of Tokyo killed more people than Hiroshima. If you want to condemn killing civilians in war, condemn war itself. Don't single out atomic weapons as uniquely immoral when conventional warfare kills just as many. Some found Dutch's moral clarity admirable. Others found it troubling. How could someone participate in an event that killed 100,000 people and sleep soundly? Didn't that suggest a lack of empathy? Dutch rejected this interpretation. Empathy, he argued, was precisely why he supported using the atomic bomb. Empathy for American soldiers who would have died invading Japan. Empathy for Japanese civilians who would have been killed in the invasion. Empathy for prisoners of war who were being starved and tortured in Japanese camps and who were scheduled to be executed if Japan was invaded. The atomic bomb saved all these people by ending the war quickly. Dutch also pointed out that the moral condemnation of atomic weapons often came from people who had never faced the choices that wartime leaders faced. It's easy to judge decisions 70 years later, he said in a 2013 interview. It's harder when you're in the moment, when millions of lives depend on your decision, when invasion is the alternative. President Truman made the right call. History has proven that. Historians continue to debate whether Truman's decision was correct. Some argue that Japan was on the verge of surrendering anyway, making the atomic bombings unnecessary. Others point to evidence that Japan's military was preparing for a suicidal last stand, and that only the shock of atomic weapons convinced Emperor Hirohito to intervene. Some argue that demonstrating the bomb on an uninhabited area would have been sufficient warning. Others note that Japan ignored warnings even after Hiroshima, requiring a second bomb at Nagasaki to force surrender. Dutch had no patience for revisionist histories that portrayed Japan as ready to surrender peacefully. They were training civilians to fight with bamboo spears, he would say. Does that sound like a nation ready to surrender? Okinawa showed us what invading Japan would cost. Every Japanese soldier fought to the death. Civilians jumped off cliffs rather than surrender. Multiplying that across the entire Japanese home islands, millions would have died. The atomic bomb prevented that. One question that Dutch faced repeatedly in his final years was about the crew's understanding of radiation and long-term effects. The Manhattan Project scientists knew atomic weapons produced radiation that could cause cancer and genetic damage, but this information wasn't shared with military personnel who would be near ground zero after the bombings. Did the crew know they were condemning survivors to years of suffering from radiation sickness? Dutch's answer was always the same. We knew the bomb was powerful. We knew it would cause massive destruction. We didn't know specific details about radiation effects. That wasn't our job to know. Our job was to deliver the weapon. Scientists and military planners made decisions about targets and warnings. We executed the mission. This division of responsibility was important to Dutch's moral calculus. He was a navigator, not a policymaker. He didn't choose the target. He didn't decide to use atomic weapons. He didn't write the warnings that were dropped on Japanese cities before the bombings. His responsibility was limited and specific. Navigate the aircraft to the target. Everything else was someone else's decision. This wasn't moral evasion in Dutch's view. It was recognition of how large organizations function. If you hold every individual responsible for every consequence of their organization's actions, organizations cannot function. Critics would argue this is precisely the logic that enables atrocities. The Nuremberg defense of, "I was just following orders." But Dutch rejected the comparison. The Nazi atrocities violated basic human rights and international law. Using military force to compel an aggressor nation to surrender did not. There was no moral equivalence between participating in genocide and participating in military operations to end a war that the enemy started. In his final years, Dutch's health declined. He developed various age-related ailments, mobility issues, hearing loss, general frailty. He moved into assisted living facilities where he could receive proper care. His wife Jean had died years earlier. His sons visited regularly, bringing grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Dutch enjoyed these visits. They connected him to the future, reminded him that life continued beyond the historical moment he inhabited. Despite his declining health, Dutch's mind remained sharp. He continued giving interviews almost until the end. In July 2014, just weeks before his death, he gave what would be his final interview to a local Georgia newspaper. The reporter asked the inevitable question, "Do you have any regrets about the mission?" Dutch's answer hadn't changed in 69 years. "No regrets. We did what we had to do. It ended the war. It saved lives. That's all that matters." On July 28, 2014, Theodore Dutch Van Kirk died peacefully in his sleep. He was 93 years old. His death was reported in major newspapers and television news programs. Headlines noted that the last survivor of the Enola Gay had died. The final direct witness to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima was gone. Obituaries summarized Dutch's life. Born in Pennsylvania, navigator in World War II, participated in the Hiroshima bombing, worked as a chemical engineer, married with 2 children, died at age 93. The facts were simple. The life was complex. Dutch had lived almost 7 decades after the mission that defined his historical significance. He had been a husband, father, grandfather, engineer, veteran. The atomic bomb mission was one day in a life that spanned 34,000 days, but it was the day that history remembered. Military veterans organizations issued statements honoring Dutch's service. The Commemorative Air Force, which preserves historic military aircraft, noted Dutch's contributions to ending World War II. The Air Force Association recognized his role in one of the most significant military operations in history. Individual veterans and veteran organizations praised Dutch for his steadfast refusal to apologize for doing his duty. But not everyone mourned Dutch's death or celebrated his life. Anti-nuclear activists and peace organizations used his death as an occasion to renew calls for nuclear disarmament. Some pointed out that Dutch's death meant all direct witnesses to atomic warfare were now gone. Would this make it easier for future leaders to use nuclear weapons, lacking the testimony of those who saw their effects? Would Dutch's generation's knowledge of atomic warfare die with them? These questions remain relevant today, decades after Dutch's death. Nuclear weapons exist in far greater numbers, and with far greater destructive power than the relatively primitive bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Cold War demonstrated how close humanity came to nuclear annihilation. Treaties have reduced stockpiles, but thousands of nuclear weapons remain active, capable of destroying civilization if used. The moral questions that Dutch faced about whether using weapons of mass destruction can ever be justified, about individual responsibility for following orders, about how we calculate lives saved versus lives taken, remain unresolved. Dutch never claimed to have all the answers to these questions. He simply insisted that in his specific historical circumstances, the decision to use atomic weapons was correct. Whether that precedent justified or discouraged future use of nuclear weapons was beyond his pay grade, as he would say. He was a navigator, not a philosopher. He calculated courses and positions, not moral absolutes. Perhaps this is the most important lesson from Dutch Van Kirk's life: the recognition that moral clarity is possible even in morally complex situations, but only if you limit your scope of responsibility to what you can actually control. Dutch could control his navigation. He could ensure the aircraft reached its target. He did that job professionally. The consequences that flowed from successfully completing that job, the deaths, the injuries, the geopolitical ramifications, the nuclear age that followed, were not his to control. He made peace with that distinction and lived his entire life without regret. Whether this represents admirable moral clarity or troubling moral compartmentalization depends on one's perspective. Dutch believed he was on the right side of history, that his actions contributed to ending the most destructive war in human history. Critics believe atomic weapons crossed a moral line, and that everyone who participated shares responsibility for that transgression. Both perspectives have merit. Both contain truth. The tension between them cannot be resolved, only acknowledged. What is indisputable is that Dutch Van Kirk lived his convictions. He never wavered. He never apologized. He never claimed victimhood or sought absolution. He stated his truth and let others judge. In an age of equivocation and moral relativism, Dutch's unwavering certainty was either refreshing or disturbing, depending on where you stood. Dutch was buried with military honors in a ceremony attended by family, friends, and veterans. His gravestone notes his rank, his service dates, and his role as navigator of the Enola Gay. The inscription is simple, factual, unadorned, just like Dutch himself. With Dutch's death, an era truly ended. All direct witnesses to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima from the American perspective were gone. The only survivors of that day who remained were Japanese civilians who had been in Hiroshima when the bomb fell. These hibakusha, the bomb-affected people, carried very different memories than Dutch. For them, August 6, 1945, was not a moment of military triumph, but a day of unimaginable horror. They saw family members vaporized. They suffered burns and radiation sickness. They lived decades with the physical and psychological scars of atomic warfare. The contrast between Dutch's memories and the hibakusha's memories illustrates war's fundamental truth. The same event can be experienced in utterly different ways, depending on where you stand. Dutch saw the atomic bomb as salvation, the weapon that ended the war and saved lives. The hibakusha saw it as annihilation, the weapon that destroyed their city and killed their loved ones. Both perspectives are real. Both are valid. History contains them both. Dutch never met any hibakusha, as far as historical records show. He never traveled to Hiroshima. He never stood at ground zero and imagined what people there experienced when the bomb exploded. Perhaps if he had, his certainty might have wavered. Or perhaps not. Dutch was capable of compartmentalizing acknowledging suffering while still maintaining that causing that suffering was necessary. This is a psychological skill that soldiers develop to function in war. Without it, the moral weight of combat becomes unbearable. In the years since Dutch's death, new historical research has continued to shed light on the decision to use atomic weapons. Declassified documents reveal the debates among American policymakers. Japanese archives show internal discussions about surrender. We know more now than we did when Dutch was alive. Yet all this additional knowledge hasn't settled the moral debate. Some historians remain convinced atomic weapons were necessary. Others remain convinced they were not. The evidence supports both conclusions, depending on how you weigh different factors. Dutch wouldn't be surprised by this ongoing debate. He knew from the beginning that dropping atomic bombs would be controversial. He knew people would question the decision. He simply didn't care. He believed the decision was correct, and nothing anyone said would change his mind. This stubbornness could be seen as intellectual rigidity. But it could also be seen as integrity, knowing what you believe and standing by it regardless of criticism. One of the most poignant aspects of Dutch's story is his loneliness in his final years as the last surviving crew member. All his comrades were dead. The people who shared his unique experience, who understood what it was like to be on that mission, were gone. Dutch was alone with his memories. Nobody else alive had been aboard the Enola Gay. Nobody else could say, "I remember that moment," and truly understand what Dutch remembered. This is the fate of all last survivors. Whether last survivors of battles, disasters, or historical events, they eventually reach a point where they are the only living person who remembers. This is a profound kind of solitude. Dutch faced it with his characteristic stoicism. He didn't complain about being alone. He simply continued telling the story as he remembered it, ensuring that his perspective would be preserved even after he was gone. The interviews Dutch gave in his final years are now historical documents. They preserve his voice, his perspective, his moral reasoning. Researchers and educators will use these interviews for decades to come. Students will watch Dutch Van Kirk explain why he had no regrets about the atomic bombing. Some will agree with him. Others will be horrified. But all will have access to the testimony of someone who was actually there, who participated in the event, who lived with the consequences. That testimony has value regardless of whether you agree with Dutch's conclusions. Dutch's family has preserved his legacy through various means. They donated his papers and personal effects to museums and archives. They participated in documentaries about the Enola Gay and the atomic bombings. They ensured that Dutch's story would be remembered accurately and completely. This is important work because historical memory is fragile. Events fade from collective consciousness when the people who experience them die. Active preservation is necessary to maintain memory across generations. The Enola Gay itself is preserved at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia. The aircraft sits in a place of honor, restored to appear as it did on August 6, 1945. Visitors can see the bomb bay where Little Boy was carried. They can see the navigator's station where Dutch worked. They can read placards explaining the mission and its historical context. The exhibit is deliberately balanced, presenting both the military justification for using atomic weapons and the humanitarian perspective on their effects. This balance reflects ongoing societal ambivalence about the atomic bombings. We honor the crew for their service and bravery, while also acknowledging the immense suffering caused by the weapons they delivered. Both truths coexist, in tension but not contradiction. If Dutch were alive today, he would likely approve of this balanced approach. He never claimed that atomic weapons didn't cause immense suffering. He simply maintained that causing that suffering was preferable to the alternatives available at the time. Acknowledging the suffering doesn't negate his point. It reinforces the tragic necessity of the decision, at least from his perspective. In the broader context of American military history, the atomic bombing missions represent a unique moment. Never before or since has the United States used nuclear weapons in combat. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings remain the only instances of atomic weapons being used in warfare. Every subsequent conflict, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, has been fought with conventional weapons, despite America's possession of far more powerful nuclear weapons than those used in 1945. This restraint suggests that American leaders internalized lessons from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nuclear weapons were too destructive, too indiscriminate, too likely to cause uncontrolled escalation to be used, except in the most extreme circumstances. Even in the Cold War, when the United States and Soviet Union possessed tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, neither side used them. The threat of mutual assured destruction deterred use. Perhaps witnessing the effects of atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki convinced leaders that nuclear war was unwinnable. Dutch took some satisfaction in this historical trajectory. He believed the atomic bombings, by demonstrating nuclear weapons' terrible power, had made future nuclear war less likely. "We showed the world what these weapons can do," he said in a 2010 interview. "Nobody wants to see that again. That's why they haven't been used since." In a strange way, Hiroshima and Nagasaki might have prevented World War III. This is a controversial claim. Critics argue that nuclear weapons could be used again if the political circumstances are right. The Cold War came frighteningly close to nuclear war on several occasions. Future conflicts could escalate to nuclear use if deterrence fails. Dutch's optimism that Hiroshima and Nagasaki had permanently deterred nuclear war might prove naive, but Dutch's point has some validity. The visceral horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the photographs of burn victims, the stories of survivors, the mushroom cloud images created a powerful cultural taboo against nuclear weapons use. This taboo has held for nearly 80 years. No nation has used nuclear weapons in combat since Nagasaki. That restraint is remarkable given that multiple nations possess nuclear weapons and many conflicts have occurred where nuclear use might have seemed advantageous from a purely military standpoint. Dutch Van Kirk's life spanned the entire nuclear age. He was there at the beginning, when atomic weapons were new and unused. He lived through the Cold War arms race, when nuclear stockpiles grew to apocalyptic levels. He witnessed the end of the Cold War and the reduction of nuclear arsenals. He saw nuclear weapons proliferate to new nations. He observed debates about nuclear terrorism and rogue states. Through all of this, he maintained his original position. Using atomic weapons to end World War II was correct, and the historical records supported that judgment. Whether history will ultimately vindicate Dutch's position remains unknowable. We cannot run the alternate history where atomic weapons weren't used. We cannot know with certainty what would have happened if Operation Downfall had proceeded. Estimates of casualties vary wildly depending on assumptions about Japanese resistance, American tactics, and intervention by other factors like Soviet invasion of Japanese-held territories. The counterfactual is forever unknowable. What is knowable is what Dutch Van Kirk believed, how he lived, and what he represented. He represented a generation of Americans who fought World War II with absolute conviction that their cause was just and their methods necessary. This generation, often called the greatest generation, is now gone. Dutch was among the last of them. Their certainty, their moral clarity, their willingness to do terrible things for what they believed were good reasons, these characteristics defined them. Whether we admire or critique those characteristics says as much about our own values as it does about theirs. Dutch Van Kirk died as he lived, with conviction, without apology, confident in his choices. He navigated the Enola Gay to Hiroshima with the same precision he brought to every other aspect of his life. He calculated the course, monitored the position, gave the heading. The atomic bomb that followed was someone else's responsibility. Dutch did his job. That was enough for him. For 69 years after Hiroshima, Dutch lived with what he had done. He raised a family. He built a career. He contributed to his community. He was a good man by most measures. The atomic bombing was one day in a life that spanned thousands of days. But it was the day that mattered historically. It was the day that defined his place in history. Now, Dutch is gone. The Enola Gay sits in a museum. The city of Hiroshima has been rebuilt and thrives. The hibakusha who survived grow fewer each year, their memories fading as they age. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima is becoming history rather than living memory. Soon, all who remember that day firsthand will be gone. We will be left with documents, photographs, films, and recorded testimonies, including Dutch Van Kirk's testimonies. When students 100 years from now study the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, they will read Dutch's words. They will hear him say he had no regrets. They will judge him by their standards, shaped by their historical moment. Perhaps they will understand why Dutch felt as he did. Perhaps they will condemn him. Either way, his testimony will endure, a voice from the past explaining why 12 men flew a mission that changed history. Dutch Van Kirk would likely be content with that legacy. He told his truth. He explained his reasoning. He made his case. History can judge. But Dutch judged himself first and found no fault in what he had done. For him, that was enough. The last man who dropped the atomic bomb is dead. The burden he carried for 7 decades has been laid down. The story continues without him, but his words remain. We did what we had to do. It ended the war. It saved lives. That's all that matters. Whether you agree or disagree, whether you honor or condemn, those words capture the perspective of a man who participated in one of history's most consequential moments and never looked back. Theodore Jerome Van Kirk, navigator, veteran, engineer, husband, father, grandfather, and the last living crew member of the Enola Gay. Rest in peace, Dutch. Your mission is complete.